Since I'm the last speaker, if I'm not mistaken, my job here is going to be, and since we haven't had a coffee break in about a couple of hours, I think my job is going to be to shock and discomfort you as much as I can, so as to stand in for the caffeine, and that we will have something to discuss when my talk is over, so we'll let it rip. Aristotle was not an evolutionary biologist. Life, for him, does not have a history in the same way as it does for us today. I think that much is obvious. I'm just going to stick in through this magnificent device. It's so obvious, in fact, that it's become a part of our identity. That is to say, after Darwin, you might say that to be a modern student of physics and biology is to define oneself against Aristotle. So that's another way of saying that it's too obvious and could use with some reconsideration. We're so certain that Aristotle's science of nature is not ours that we no longer feel the need to understand correctly why this is so often enough. But since we are defined against him, that entails that we no longer really understand ourselves. So I suggest that trying to articulate what Aristotle would see, as the greatest obstacle to accepting an evolutionary picture of life will do us some good. That's what I'm going to try to do. And the obstacle is not found where we usually look for it. Now, we can dismiss right off the bat the claim that what primarily separates Aristotle from modern biology is his primitive instrumentation and his lack of empirical sensibility. It's certainly true that Aristotle's natural treatises contain many howlers, famous mistake, although far fewer than is commonly thought. And it's true that his research was inevitably hamstrung by the lack of microscopes, the lack of suitable diversity of biological populations, the lack of a broad and scientifically sound fossil record. Nevertheless, much of Aristotle's careful observational work is superb, even amazing. As for errors and technical limitations, he would gladly admit the point. It wouldn't cost him very much to do so. For Aristotle, too, there is no natural science without observation. And our explanatory schemas cannot run too far ahead of our observational powers without courting disaster. So where observations are faulty or incomplete, so too will the explanations. Aristotle was aware, for example, and perhaps even annoyed by the limitations of his time and place. He admits quite openly, for example, that his account of bee reproduction leaves much to be desired, because, as he says, the facts haven't been sufficiently ascertained. He means I can't see what's going on inside the hive. It's actually that only solved with high-speed cameras. I see that it's a little bit like being in the United Nations, so I have to put my thing here. If in the future the facts are ascertained, says Aristotle, then credence must be given to the direct evidence of the senses, more than to the logos, to the account theory. A greater difficulty is his commitment to the fixity or eternity of the species. Aristotle does seem to hold that biological generation of particulars of the same species goes on eternally. As James Lennox argues, the best possible state of affairs for organisms, given that each of them, each token, right, each individual, cannot exist eternally, is to be a member of an everlasting continuous series of organisms, the same in form, though not in number. And moreover, for Aristotle, biological generation is everlasting in both directions. Into the past, since the existence of the child requires the previous existence of the parent of the same kind. And into the future, because the natural impulse to produce is to produce the same kind. So there will then, Aristotle says, always be kinds of men and plants and animals. Does this not entail then, ipso facto, that Aristotle could never accept a worldview in which biological kinds develop from one another in time? There's no doubt that Aristotle's belief that the species are fixed will have to be revised. But this can be done within the overall structure of his metaphysics, as Professor Halper showed yesterday. And that metaphysics will continue to provide powerful explanatory resources for scientific inquiry. For the evolutionary paradigm can be integrated into Aristotle's broader commitment to form as more fundamental and more explanatory than material. Form for Aristotle is not a static or heavenly paradigm, or a picture, or perfect dog up in the sky or whatever. Form is activity, the activity of maintaining determinate identity and dynamic stability through change. Form explains the organism's openness to further determinations while remaining itself. And there are ways, and you have to do a bit of pyrotechnics, I won't do here, but there are ways to explain how form can be subject, at Aristotelian form, to accidental and environmental changes which introduce modifications that cumulatively and over time lead to new organisms, no longer capable of reproduction with the tokens of their ancestor group, but capable of reproduction among themselves, a new species, in other words. Moreover, Aristotle conceives of organic nature as a kind of graded relation of species along an ascending continuum of complexity, which proceeds by differentials that are so small that he himself confesses that it is hard to discern the boundary between species and indeed between living things and inanimate things. Right? The scale of nature, the scala naturae. That ladder that you see there could be laid on its side, as it were, along a temporal continuum of development, which what is constant is not particular species, but the natural activity of form, not only in persevering, but in actualizing potentials, the potencies. Among those potencies would have to be the power of transformative adaptation, even the word tells you. Transformative adaptation which brings forth new species. There's a more difficult problem, and that's, of course, the question of the directionality or lack thereof in evolutionary processes. In other words, the question of randomization versus Aristotelian teleology. On this point, Aristotle is unreconcilable. While he recognizes a place for chance and accidental causes in nature, they will always be posterior to and subordinate to final causality. As he says, not chance, but purpose, telos, is predominant in the works of nature. It is this in the final analysis, by the way, that leads him to reject Empedocles' tantalizing suggestion. Aristotle says Empedocles was wrong when he said that many of the characteristics which animals have are due to some accident in the process of their formation. This comes from his book, Aristotles and Pneumonia. Human beings are begotten by human beings. That sentence must appear hundreds of times in Aristotle's work. Human beings are begotten by human beings. And therefore, the process of the child's formation is what it is, because the parent was what it was. So, an explanation of evolutionary history exclusively in terms of material or accidental factors is indeed anti-Aristotelian. Nature is telos, or final causality. It's a complex of for the sake of relations. So here the distance between Aristotle's conception and the modern one may be unbridgeable. And yet even here, the two positions can come within a kind of hailing distance of one another. As Stephen J. Gould points out, randomness does not mean random in the mathematical sense, right? Equally likely in all directions. It doesn't mean that. We simply mean that variation occurs with no preferred orientation in adaptive direction overall. It is not the case that any and every conceivable variation is possible at any and every given time for any and every organism. Mutations are in fact quite constrained by numerous factors. And if you come at the same problem from the other direction, you have to be precise when we speak of Aristotle and his teleology. Telos certainly does not mean conscious design or plan imposed onto nature from the outside. Telos picks out the natural impulse of living things to achieve the full actualization of their potential, or at most to the drive of those organic individuals to preserve their species count. So while there are profound metaphysical questions implicated in trying to reconcile evolutionary and Aristotelian views of the character of organic development, both are animated by an intuition about the unity of nature, which in evolution is evidenced by our common genetic ancestry, and for Aristotle by the fact that the world is not such a thing, that the world is not such that one thing has nothing to do with another. There's always relation. Aristotle says the world is not like a bad, tragic series of acts related one next to another. So we haven't yet gotten to the most profound disagreement. We can get there, I think, by formulating the comprehensive hopes of evolutionary theory in a question. Can all characteristic activities of living organisms be explained as having come to be in terms of evolutionary theory? Now, for Aristotle, that question would be downstream from a prior question. Can all characteristic activities of living organisms be understood as having come to be simplicity at all, come to be at all? And his answer to that question is known. We can understand why not by studying a small section of Aristotle's embryology, which appears in on the generation of atoms, which is the culminating part of his zoological corpus. Now, first of all, a warning. I am not going to dwell here on the well-known fact that the mechanics of Aristotle's embryology is faulty and infinitely deficient in detail when compared with our own. Right? We know that his division of labor between the male and the female in reproduction, the male provides the formal principle, but the female provides only the material principle. That's a dead duck. And his attempts to understand how exactly species form is, transmitted from the parent to the offspring, and the way it's done in terms of the physical mechanics, was undone by the lack of any serviceable account of cell biology. I don't need to dwell on all this because on the main point, Aristotle's physical insight did not fail him. In the 17th and 18th chapters of Disagreement, Book 1, Aristotle treats in detail a hypothesis which was held, it seems, by Hippocrates and maybe by others, according to which sperm is constituted of material drawn from the whole body of the parent, so that embryonic development is the growth of bodily organs already present, fully formed in miniature. Aristotle refutes this precursor of pangenesis and sees correctly that what is present is the potential for articulation into new organic structure. Embryonic development is not the inflation of miniature organs with a bite pump, right? It is the ordered construction of new ones, according to a formal plan, what we would call the genetic. So despite a complete ignorance of molecular structure, Aristotle grasped with exemplary clarity the principle by which DNA operates, as Max Delbruck says in the article that I quoted yesterday. This is surely one of the greatest of Greek speculative achievements, I think. But it leaves Aristotle with a heavy task. He has to explain now when and how each soul function, nutrition, reproduction, perception, intellection, finds its place in embryonic development. And that's the topic of Book 2. Aristotle says there that in any process, that which is formed must of necessity be formed out of something, ektinos, by something, hypotinos, and into something, istin. In our case, the ektinos, the out of something, is the organic matter provided by the mother, which is in potency to become some particular organism. It's a catch, right? It's not just any organic matter. In potency to become a human being. The hypotinos is the seed, to sperma, which is provided by the father, the formal principle which articulates the matter. Strictly speaking, of course, it's not the seed as a body that does this, but the generative power present in it. And this generative power, Aristotle calls the pneuma. Now, pneuma is, I think, one of the most mysterious terms in all of Aristotle's natural science. Its regular, everyday meaning is breath, right? The New Testament has the meaning of spirit. And it's a physical substance, but it's of a different nature for Aristotle than the familiar elements, earth, air, water, fire. It is somehow, he says, analogous with the divine ether, the substance of heavenly bodies. So for Aristotle too, just like for us, though for different reasons, we're made of stardust. Pneuma, more accurately, the nature in the pneuma, while not itself soul, somehow bridges the gap between the immaterial principle of form and the material which is to become the articulated offspring. It's, if you will, the vehicle by which soul comes to be in the embryo. And soul, of course, is the form of a living body. The relation of the formal principle through pneuma to the material is like the relationship of a carpenter through his tools to the wood. The carpenter, by moving the hands and the tools, imparts by this movement, or he imparts movement to the hands and the tools, and they, by that movement, impress the form onto the wood. So by virtue of the presence of pneuma in the seed and the sperm, the latter is soul potential, capable of bringing forth in the material of the new offspring each psychic function, seriatim. Now we're owed an answer to the question about whether soul exists, quote, originally in the semen and embryo or not. And if so, where does it come from? And Aristotle's answer to that question is the one you would expect. Soul, psyche, comes into the embryo being potentially present in the sperm. The nutritive power of the soul is the first thing to be formed in the embryo. And once that's up and running, so for Aristotle, the first organ that has to be formed is heart. And then blood has to appear. We're looking at chicken eggs and things like Once a heart and blood are up and running, the organic material of the embryo is now ensouled and can take on the higher functions, say perception and flesh. And in regard to these, you should expect more of the same, right? They too should be present potentially in the seed before being in the embryo. But this point proves fiendishly hard for Aristotle to explain how this is the case. For it's not the case, he says, that when an animal does not come to be at the same time, an animal and a man, or a horse, or any other particular animal. I.e., what's formed first is the nutritive function. The particular functions that distinguish horse or man, like perception or reasoning, those come later. For the end, the telos, is developed last, and the peculiar character of the species is the end of the generation of each individual. For this reason, it is a question of the greatest difficulty, aporia placement, which we must strive to solve to the best of our ability and as far as possible. Here's the question of greatest difficulty. When and how and from where is a share in intellect acquired by those animals which participate in this principle? Where does it come from? Stated simply, intellect is the character of the human species, and the goal, therefore, of its generation. But how does this defining character come to be present in a process whose character it defines? Now, Aristotle proceeds to list the possible answers to the question of greatest difficulty. He says, any soul faculty present in the embryo must either have existed previously or come to be with the generation of the embryo. It must either be produced in the female contribution or enter the female contribution from the male one. Now, since the first option is ruled out of court by Aristotle, the male provides the formal and the woman on the material. So, any faculty which comes to be in the male contribution must either come to it from some outside source or not. Now, I can readily imagine that. For innocent bystanders like you, it's hard to see why this question, of all things, should be such a pickle. Why can't we just apply here the well-worn distinction that Aristotle always uses between, potential and actual, dynamis and energeia, and say that the functions of the rational soul come to be in the embryo having been potentially present in the seed? Who needs all of this, very un-Aristotelian talk when you think about it, about pre-existing or coming in from the outside? To see what the problem is here, let's take a step back and look at perception. The powers of perception and locomotion are, like the nutritive soul, perfectly inseparable from body. Hence, the potential for these faculties cannot enter the seed in an embodied state. There is, as Aristotle dryly points out, no walking without feet, right? Locomotion has to happen. It's a profound point there. So these powers must come to be with the coming to be of the sperm itself, being embodied there by the generative power of Pneumonia. Okay, that's good. But then Aristotle concludes with amazing dispatch. Intellect enters into the seed from the outside, theorate, as it were, comes in from the door, right? For no bodily activity has any connection at all with the activity of intellect. No bodily energeia has any connection at all with the activity of intellect. That is to say, the rational faculty is not formed when the seed is formed. It isn't formed beforehand either. It isn't formed after. It isn't formed at all. It appears in the seed already as what it is, with Aristotle having no further explanation for how this can be. The intellect, he says, in De Anima, on the soul, seems to be born in us already as an independent thing in ousia, and to be imperishable. So pneuma is the vehicle of soul, but apparently in two ways. Partly it's inseparable from physical matter, and that's where we get nutrition and things like that, perception, and partly separable from physical matter, and then it's the vehicle for intellect to enter into the embryo. Now this is ignore the primitive mechanics here, it's totally uninteresting. This is a very odd situation. Aristotle is very explicit that man develops the way he does, the human being, because the human being exercises reason. We develop the way we do because we exercise reason. And he says, Anaxagoras says that man is the most intelligent of animals because he has hands. It would have been better to say that he has hands because he's the most intelligent. We have the physical form that we do. Upright posture, opposable thumbs, forward vision, because we're rational animals. It's not that being rational somehow developed accidentally in the process. And pneuma is supposed to be the power which acts upon the organic matter in order to articulate the organs and the limbs that are going to be for the sake of the full functioning of this rational animal. Pneuma is the intimation, the trace of rationality already at work in a microscopic level, already tending towards the rational soul. And nevertheless, there's a break. The tendency, the nisus in development, does not develop into intellect. That's why the great Aristotelian scholar, the English Aristotelian scholar David Hall says, we can't say, strictly speaking, that man is composed so as to be capable of intellection, because intellect isn't the product of any composition. Now, Baum sort of takes that in stride, but I mean really, in light of Aristotle's commitment to teleological development and to the rationality of the human species difference, this is unsatisfactory on his own terms. Why has intellect brought him to such a pass? To begin to grasp what's at stake here and to see how it might apply to us as well, we have to resist the temptation to translate the word nous with modern terms like cognition or consciousness or, God forbid, mind. Each one of those terms is a conceptual train wreck. No one has ever been able to separate the quick from the dead in terms like mind or cognition or consciousness. I have never heard a single clear description of what mind means. So if you start thinking that when Aristotle says intellect comes in, or nous comes in separately, he means mind or consciousness floats in separately from the outside and is pre-existing and immortal, this is going to be trying to explain the opaque by the impenetrable. The word knowing is the present infinitive of the verb noeo. I'm not going to quiz you on the Greek, so don't worry. It's a comprehensive term for a variety of what we would call rational activities. Thinking things through, devising, calculating, intending, conceiving, or even simply the power of discriminating one thing from another, which is why, by the way, Aristotle has no problem saying that animals have a kind of nous, because they are able to guide themselves by discriminating. You might translate it with just the word thinking as a suitably elastic equivalent. Nous, however, is often an Aristotelian term for a specific kind of thinking, one that has to be present in us, as Aristotle says here, so that we can be capable of all the others. It is the pure power by which we are directly in contact with the truth, or the essential form of things. Pure because it's not subordinated either to sense perception. It's not subordinated either to sense perception or to discursive thinking. So to distinguish nous from thinking in general, we could translate that as intellect, provided that we don't misunderstand intellect just as the ability to build theories or models, or to perform spectacular mathematical acrobatics. We must also remember that Aristotle does not have a representational theory of mind, in which thinking is primarily the construction and the presentation by consciousness to itself of mental images. Intellect is not representation or apperception. It is the soul's actively being open, not just open like a window is, but actively being open to the intelligibility of things. And in this, there's a certain parallel between the way intellect works for Aristotle and the way perception, sense perception, works for Aristotle. Sense perception is the soul's actively being open to the visibility of things, just like intellect is actively being open to the intelligibility of things. So let's take vision, for example. This is the power residing in the eye and directed towards and able to take on the visibility of things. What is visibility for Aristotle? Color, of course. The power to be seen through the medium of light. In the act of seeing, the power of vision is activated by the power of visibility in the colored surface and takes on that visible form, the green and brown of the tree, let's say. This is not the creation of a mental picture of the tree, or something called an object. I can assure you that no one has ever seen anything called an object with their eyes. Rather, when sight actively sees and the visible color is actively being seen, Aristotle says our vision and the tree's visibility become one. There are two modes of being. It's different to be the power to see and the power to be seen, but they are differently being one in number in the act of perception. Now, how do matters stand with intellect? Aristotle says, as to the part of the soul by which it knows and understands, whether it is a separate part, not separate in magnitude, but only in meaning, one must consider what distinguishing character it has and how thinking ever happens. Now, let's put a big star next to the word if thinking works the same way perceiving does, it would either be some way of being acted upon by intelligible things, or something else of this sort. It must be without attributes, but receptive of the intelligible form, and it must be potentially as the form is, though not identical with it. And as the power of perception is to perceptible things, so is intellect to intelligible things. Okay, so far so good. The seeing power becomes one with the visible, the colored shape. The intellectual power sees through this visible form to become one with the intelligible essence of the thing. It knows this green and brown colored shape as a tree. Aristotle says that intellect has no form of its own. Hence it can become all intelligible forms, and therefore know them. By the way, it'll have no problem doing this, even if the shape of the tree is broad and rounded like the oak, but it can still do it if it's tall and spindly like the Mediterranean cypress that we have here in our country. It'll still do it if we hack off half the branches. It'll still be able to do it if we're in New England and we're lucky enough, right, and the colors of the tree are no longer green, but red and orange and so on and so forth. The perceptible form changes, but there is something in us that is able to penetrate through all of this variety and strike true and recognize a unity of intelligible properties here called what it is to be a tree. This utterly astounding power, which small children already have, is nous. However, as Aristotle continues to investigate what intellect is, crucial differences between intellection and sense perception, which happens with the body, crucial differences appear. The power of sensing operates only in the presence of something sensible. That's why we can't, of course, see whenever we want and see whatever we want. Each sensory power is determined by a proper sense of it, which can't be grasped by any other sense. So color for eyes, sound for ears. Senses, so there are some things that all senses or several senses can perceive, like motion or size, but these are incidentally perceived. Each sense is activated only by its own proper sensible. I can see you here as people, but only because you have some color. Any perceptive power is the movement from some potential to some activity in some bodily function. Seeing and being seen can only be realized in matter. Now, none of this can be true of intellect in the same sense, which is why the pure power of nous requires its own analysis in the infamous 4th and 5th chapters of Aristotle's third book of the Analects. I think it's not an exaggeration of Professor Halpern might agree or disagree that this section should count as one of the most difficult series of philosophical lines of prose ever written. That's really saying something. It's a high standard. So it's going to be poor taste for me to inflict upon you an extended interpretation. What I'll have to do is just make some ex cathedra pronouncements about the difference between intellect and everything else, and you're going to have to believe me. Sight sees only colors. Hearing hears only sounds. Nous can think anything at all. It doesn't have one proper intelligence. Sense perception can only move from potential to actual when a sensed object is present. Nous, once it's been activated by learning, has its objects within itself, says Aristotle. It can think whenever it wants. Sense perception is linked essentially to some material change in the body. But because the objects of intellect are not in matter, it's impossible to understand nous as the realization of some potential in matter. This is not to deny that measurable material changes may occur and accompany thought. Aristotle, I think, would be amazed, but not rendered speechless by our ability to use an fMRI and see what happens, what electrical events happen in the brain when we understand that 2 + 3 = 5 is an identity statement between both sides of the equal sign. But that's not the same thing as saying that those electrical events, or the neurons in which they happen, are understanding this identity, which is, of course, complete nonsense. You notice how I just threw that grenade at the cognitive scientist there. The power to see and the power to be seen in vision, right, depend on an external medium, light. Light makes colors actually visible. Is there a parallel to this in intellection? According to the Anima 3.5, there is. One sort of intellect, says Aristotle, or perhaps one aspect of intellect, is the passive ability to know all things, while another aspect of intellect makes all things, in a way like an active condition like light does. For in a certain sense, light too makes colors that are potential be active as colors. And this sort of intellect is separate, without attributes, and unmixed. For its being at work, its essential nature, is to be active. That's to say, intellect is its own medium. Now, the nature of this so-called active intellect is, nourished ferocious disagreements for 2,500 years about whether it's a divine aspect of our intellect or a separate divine intellect that acts on ours from the outside. Happily, we don't need to decide that question. All we need to note is that there is present in us a power that is always active. It's not sometimes active, it's sometimes potential. It has a kind of awareness that is purely transparent to the intelligible truth of things. And it is a power, as Aristotle says, which is always exactly what it is. In intellect, Aristotle finds something possessing an independence and a universality and a self-sufficiency that is so awesome that it escapes all standard developmental categories. While intellect, too, moves from potentially knowing something to actively knowing it, this movement is non-standard. For intellect moves itself by virtue of something about it which never comes to be, but is simply always constantly busy being. The end result, and with this I'm going to conclude, is as follows. On the one hand, Aristotelian nous is that part of the soul which is not a nature, he says. It can't be a subject for natural science properly understood. On the other hand, Aristotle also says in metaphysics, the activity of intellect is life. He does not mean by this that everything thinks, but rather that the unimpeded activity of nous, its always active openness towards the world, its self-related unity through change, are the paradigms of what living activity is. But there remains an unreconciled discontinuity here between nature and the principle of nature. The principle of nature explains nature's development, but the principle cannot be explained through the development. Which is to say that Aristotle might come to accept the evolution of the species from one another over time, and he'd have to modify his views about the place of randomness or accident in nature. What he would deny, however, is the totalizing claim of evolutionary biology to an explanation of all life. That claim, of course, is not a scientific datum. It's a metaphysical hope about evolution's explanatory power. Aristotle, I think, would likely see this hope as doomed to remain unfulfilled for the following reason. Evolutionary theory is a magnificent achievement of our ability to suppose and devise and deliberate and apprehend. In short, it's an achievement of our ability to think. Now, if that theory is to fulfill its comprehensive claim, it's going to have to explain, without begging the question and without leaving remainders, how thinking itself, the very capacity directed towards truth and defined in terms opposed to blind chance, how thinking itself could have come to be as a result of a directionless process. And Aristotle would find this to be a hopeless category mistake. Because intellect isn't the result of any process. However you understand, intellect isn't a result at all. It's a first principle. For this reason, I think he probably would not be surprised by our current predicament. The question of whether evolutionary theory will ever explain on its own terms the appearance of the being that is capable of knowing it remains for us the question of greatest difficulty. In this, despite everything that has changed, we and Aristotle are equal. Thank you.
Amazing. Questions, and then we go for coffee. Yes, please.
Maybe we should go for coffee and then next question.
Andrew, that was fascinating. I'm curious, though, about whether Aristotle paid any attention to the development of children as part of his observational repertoire.
He didn't even have it.
He didn't have any, but presumably...
No, he did.
He did?
No, sure.
Okay, all right. So particularly with regard to the intellect, I mean, certainly small children exhibit signs of intellect, but the infant has very little. So would that not have suggested some kind of developmental process in the construction of the intellect? And was that part of the evidence that he considered?
The intellect does develop in the following sense. We are born as human beings, as infants already, with what Aristotle calls the passive intellect, meaning the capacity to become all things.
A potential.
No, well, this is a complicated point. The passive intellect is there as soon as we open our eyes. The child has it too, which is why a child is not just, it's simply false to think that a child is simply staring at the world there. I mean, beyond, once they're aware. But once their awareness is at work, They are taking in this world as an ordered structure. That's what Aristotle would call the process of learning. Once that is done, so here there is an element of development, but once that is done, and this is the famous disagreement how this works, we are able to actively think whenever we want. And that active power, which is not necessarily tied to language, so I don't want you to think that that only happens when the kid can start to speak, because that's not what it means. But once that appears in us, there appears in us an activity that is, I don't know quite how to say it, it's in us, happening in us, but it is not of us, not a product of the development leading up to it.
Despite the fact that it comes from this prior process of learning.
It doesn't. That's the discontinuity. The process allows intellect to absorb the world, and then the active intellect, once it's there, is not the result of the process leading up to it.
I see.
It's as it were, a light that goes on without the wiring that precedes it.
But I'm still puzzled as to why that might not have been a solution to the problem Aristotle was trying to solve, as it seems to have been a solution to some of the other problems that he was trying to solve. Why was the evident, sort of increase or development or evolution of the intellect over that period of time in infancy not a sign that it was not something coming from elsewhere?
No, it is something that comes from elsewhere.
Well, that's what he was saying, but could
Well, why is it not something coming from elsewhere? Well, how shall I put this? There's an old debate which I didn't want to go into, but since you started, about whether when Aristotle is talking about the active element of our intellect, the thing that acts like light, as it were. So light, when he says light makes all colors be actively colors, what does that mean? We have to think about that for a second. It doesn't mean that the light paints the wall, whatever color it is, right? Of course it doesn't do that. It makes the color visible. So there's something in our intellect that, or let me put it this way, the light makes the colors actually seen. There's something in our intellect that makes intelligible things that are intelligible, even when we're not thinking, we're asleep, we're drunk, things that are intelligible, actually be thought. That actually being thought, that activity of actually thinking, to Aristotle seems so self-contained and so incredible in its power that it can't be the process of any development, which is why he seems to speak of it as either a divine intellect operating on us from the outside, which is one interpretive tradition that's done, or an aspect of our intellect that when we study it enough, we realize this is what God must be like. This part of the intellect has no development. It doesn't take time. I mean, it happens in time, but it doesn't take any time. It doesn't have parts. It's a complete unitary act. And for that, Aristotle thinks there can't be a developmental explanation. So if you go back to the slide of 2 + 3 = 5, right? Our brain is made up of millions or billions, I don't know how many neurons in there, firing to one another through their synapses and so on and so forth. But the act of understanding that the two sides of that equal sign are essentially two ways of saying one thing is an act that happens all at once. It's not, well, now I understand 60% of 2 + 3 = 5, okay, now we're up to 75%, keep going. That doesn't happen. It couldn't happen. The whole thing happens all at once. It's always itself. This, Aristotle thinks, can't have an explanation, which is strange, because he seems to explain everything else. It goes right up to there, and then it stops.
Could I just add a comment to this, which is really also a question? Is it not the case that for Aristotle, as for Plato, the upbringing of children up till about age 7 took place in the women's quarters and not among the people that Aristotle would have bothered to talk to or observe in action? I mean, I think one of the things that's always struck me is about these theories of the boom, the Big Bang appearance of intellectuality, is that there was a 7-year black box that was dominated by women that these guys never bothered to talk to.
Unfortunately, that's, of course we all know that Aristotle has his blind spots we talk about, but that's not the case. women are rational creatures just as men.
No.
It's not that intellect is not operating.
I wasn't saying that he didn't think the women were rational. What I was saying was that the process of the development of the child's mind would have, if my understanding is right, you could correct me, would have occurred out of his observation because it occurred in the women's quarters.
No, Aristotle has extremely interesting observations of the way children operate.
Children or infants?
Both. One of Aristotle's interesting observations is the following one. When he's trying to discuss how our intellectual power, which, as he says, is born in us already what it is, stabilizes itself so that it can hit home. He gives the example of a child who, when they first start speaking, call all men father and all women mother.
Okay.
Now, what's going on there? That's a very interesting example when you think about it. The child is seeing something, right? They're making a mistake, obviously. Not all men are their father, but they're seeing something. What are they seeing?
Categories.
Right, they're seeing a certain category. Deep voices, stick the name father onto those. Higher voices, stick the name mother. Of course, a mistake, but what is the nature of the correction of that mistake? It's, as it were, the soul's rational faculty stabilizing itself over time, and eventually he narrows the category down correctly. Right, he keeps cutting, chop, 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 chop. That, says Aristotle, is happening very, very early in life, which is why a very interesting Hegelian scholar said, well, if you want to see nous, the way Aristotle means it, you have to look into the eyes of very small children. Before they start speaking, nous is already out.
Yeah.
It seems to me, I mean, I don't know so very much, it seems to me that the concept of nous is very Platonic. And I wonder whether also the form concept, which I have now heard a couple of different explanations of, is also Platonic.
Nous is, I guess you could say, if you want it to be accurate, a Platonic Aristotelian term for pure thinking. Plato uses it in much the same way as Aristotle does. Yes, so, when we say that Aristotle, the Aristotle-Plato relationship is often described like it's a soap opera, General Hospital or something. The two of them had daggers. That's of course not true. They agreed on many things, disagreed on other things, and the fact that they use the same philosophical terminology, these people lived together for 20 years, it's not surprising.
No, I meant especially the idea that the nous gives access to the truth of the world. And that seems to me relating to the world of Plato, which we cannot really otherwise grasp.
Well, here there is a similarity. Nous gives us access to the intelligibility of things, for Plato and for Aristotle. The disagreement between them, or at least Aristotle thinks there's a disagreement between them, about how to understand what it means to be a form, to be the intelligibility. He thinks that Plato is either guilty of, or at least the way Plato presents his philosophy causes this misunderstanding, that the forms are some disembodied paradigmatic picture up in the heavens. And that, says Aristotle, is a disaster, because the form is supposed to be the essence of the thing. So how can the essence of the thing be in another world when the thing is supposed to be the essence of it? For Aristotle, he thinks he solved this problem by saying that form is activity, energeia, a being at work of the thing, in the particular. So that's sort of the general agreement and disagreement between them. I think it is true that Aristotle thinks he can account for form as within nature, always in some kind of matter. The catch is that God is a kind of activity that has no matter, just form or just energeia. And here I always feel that Aristotle is climbing up Mount Everest and hacking away there, and then he gets up to the top, and Plato is standing there and saying, so there is one form. That's a silly one, but so there is both agreement and disagreement there.
Okay, let's thank all the speakers of this session.
Thank you very much.
Will you give a 15 minutes or 10
No,
minutes?
maybe we can cut the coffee break short.